The fog didn't roll into the valley. It dropped like a wet wool blanket. Within 10 minutes, the green-black canopy of the Douglas firs vanished, replaced by a gray, featureless wall that swallowed the sound of our boots on the damp pine needles. My name is Marcus. I've spent 9 years with the county search and rescue team, mostly tracking lost hikers who thought a smartphone map was a substitute for a compass. I've seen the Cascade Range in every temper imaginable, but this was different. The air had that sharp, metallic taste that comes right before the temperature takes a dive. Behind me, Elena was adjusting the straps of her field pack. She wasn't one of my regular SAR team members. She was a wildlife biologist attached to our training exercise to help us map game trails that lost civilians often wander into. She was quiet, observed everything, and carried herself with the kind of low-key confidence that only comes from spending months alone in the brush. "Radio's dead, Marcus," Elena said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the high-pitched flutter that usually indicates a civilian is starting to panic. Just static and a hum. The ridgeline must be blocking the repeater. I pulled my own radio from my shoulder harness, switched channels, and blew a breath into the receiver. Nothing but the dry hiss of white noise. "We're about 3 miles south of the primary search grid," I said, checking my analog watch. The training run was supposed to wind down by 4. It's 4:30. They'll notice we aren't at the extraction point within the hour. "They won't come looking until morning," Elena replied. She stepped up beside me, her eyes scanning the gray wall of fog. "Not in this. The safety officer won't risk putting a team on the ridge with zero visibility. It's too easy to walk off a shelf." She was right. The terrain here was treacherous, broken basalt ridges, hidden under thick moss and sudden 20-foot drops that didn't show up on standard topographic maps. "We keep moving downhill," I suggested, though I knew the risks. "If we hit the creek bed, we can follow the water out to the logging road." Elena shook her head slowly. Her hood was pulled low, beads of moisture clinging to the green synthetic fabric. "The creek bed is a trap in this weather. The rocks are slick as grease, and if the temperature drops another 5 degrees, that wet clay is going to freeze solid. We'll break an ankle before we cover half a mile." She pointed toward a massive ancient western red cedar about 30 yards off the trail. Its lower branches were thick as tree trunks, creating a dry, protected dome of needles beneath its canopy. "We aren't moving." We set up camp right here. I looked at the tree, then back at the fog. My SAR training manual explicitly stated that lost personnel should make every effort to reach a known point of interest before dark. But the manual didn't account for the damp, bone-chilling cold of a Pacific Northwest marine layer. The manual says, "I started." "The manual was written by someone sitting in an office in Olympia," Elena interrupted, a small, dry smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "That tree has been standing for 300 years. It knows how to shed water. We don't." I let out a breath, watching it bloom into a white cloud in the sharpening cold. "All right, we hold here, but we need to get a shelter up before our body heat drops. The dampness is what kills you out here, not just the temperature." "Agreed," she said, already unbuckling her pack. "You handle the heavy timber. I'll gather the dry bedding from under the root flares." There was no debate, no division of labor based on anything other than practical utility. I unclipped my folding saw from my belt. My hands were already stiffening up. The damp cold has a way of creeping under your fingernails and settling into your joints before you even realize you're shivering. I went to work on a stand of dead lodgepole pine. About 20 yards away, the wood was dry on the inside, protected by the dense canopy above. Each stroke of the saw sounded muffled, the sound dying in the thick fog. I cut 4 stout poles about 8 feet long to form the frame of a basic lean-to against the trunk of the giant cedar. By the time I dragged the 3rd pole back, Elena had already cleared a 5-foot circle of damp debris down to the dry, fragrant cedar needles beneath. She was working with a systematic, unhurried pace. "You've built these before," I observed, leaning the poles against the massive trunk. "3 seasons in the high Olympics tracking wolf populations," she said, without looking up. She was using a flat piece of bark to shovel dry needles into a thick pile at the head of our designated sleeping area. "If you don't learn how to make a dry bed, you spend the night shivering so hard your teeth crack. It's not a great way to sleep." "No," I agreed. "I've seen hikers who spent one night on wet ground. They look like they've been through a car wreck by morning." I began lashing the poles together using a length of orange paracord from my emergency kit. My fingers were clumsy, the skin white around the knuckles. Elena noticed. She didn't say anything, but she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small foil-wrapped hand warmer. She slid it onto the flat rock where I was working. "Take a minute," she said. "Stiff fingers make bad knots. If the lean-to collapses at midnight, I'm sleeping on your side." "Fair point," I said. I took the hand warmer, pressing it between my palms. The heat was chemical and sharp, a small comfort against the vast chill of the forest. "Thanks." "Don't get used to it," she muttered, though her tone was light. "That's my only pair." We worked in silence for the next hour. The forest was settling into that deep, heavy quiet that precedes a winter night. The fog had turned from light gray to a dark, bruised charcoal. We couldn't see more than 10 feet past our shelter now. I laid the pine poles parallel to each other, creating a sloped roof. And then we began shingling it with thick, flat cedar boughs that Elena had harvested from the lower, live branches. We laid them from the bottom up, ensuring the needles pointed downward to shed the moisture. It was tedious work, but necessary. Every gap was a potential leak, and in this country, a leak meant a cold, miserable night. By the time we finished, the shelter looked like a natural extension of the tree's root system. It was low, dark, and thick enough to block the wind that had begun to rattle the high canopy. "Inside," Elena said, gesturing toward the small opening. I crawled in first, dragging our packs behind me. The space was tight, roughly 6 feet long and 4 feet wide. With both of us inside, our shoulders would be touching, but that was the point. In a survival situation, space is just volume you have to heat with your own lungs. Elena crawled in after me, pulling her pack into the entrance to block the wind. The air inside immediately felt different. It was dry, smelled heavily of cedar sap and rich earth, and the raw, biting wind was instantly cut to a whisper. "Not bad," I said, settling back onto the thick mattress of dry needles she had prepared. "I've stayed in 3-star hotels with worse insulation." "The mattress is the key," Elena said, pulling her knees up to her chest to conserve heat. "Most people think they need to focus on the roof, but the earth is a giant heat sink. It'll suck the warmth right out of your spine if you let it." She pulled her space blanket from her kit, a heavy-duty olive green tarp, lined with reflective silver material on one side. She spread it over the dry needles, and we sat on it, shoulder to shoulder, our knees nearly touching the low ceiling of our shelter. "So," Elena said, her voice quiet in the small space. "Marcus the veteran, how many times have you been on this side of the search?" "Twice," I admitted, leaning my head back against the rough cedar bark. "Once in the North Cascades during a late October sleet storm, my partner and I got stuck on a scree field. We didn't have a tree like this. We spent 14 hours huddled under a single bivy sack, listening to the rocks slide down the mountain." "Did you talk?" "Not much," I said. "When it's that cold, talking feels like wasting energy. You just focus on the next breath. You count them. 1, 2, 3, until the light starts to change. That sounds lonely?" "It was," I said. I looked at her. Her face was half shadowed in the dim light of the shelter, her eyes bright and steady. This is better." She didn't answer immediately. "Yeah." She reached into her pack and pulled out a small metal flask and 2 stainless steel cups that nested together. "My father taught me that a proper scientist never goes into the field without a chemical analysis kit," she said, unscrewing the lid. "And what are we analyzing? Single malt scotch," she said, pouring a small amber splash into each cup. "For medicinal purposes. Vasodilation. It's in the manual, isn't it?" "Section 4, paragraph 2, I lied, accepting the cup. The metal was cold, but the liquid inside was warm, smelling of peat smoke and dried fruit. Our fingers brushed as she handed me the cup. Her skin was cool, but her grip was firm. "To the tree," I said, raising the cup. "To the tree," she agreed. The liquor hit the back of my throat like a small, clean fire. It spread down my chest, easing the tight defensive hunch my shoulders had held since the fog rolled in. I let out a long breath, feeling the tension drain away. "You're not what I expected," I said after a moment. "Oh," she set her cup down on her knee. "What did you expect? A lab technician who gets nervous when she can't see her microscope." "Something like that," I admitted. "Most of the academic specialists we get on these exercises spend the whole time complaining about the lack of cellular service and the quality of the trail rations. I spent 3 years living in a yurt in the wilderness of Idaho," she said, her voice dropping into a quiet, rhythmic cadence. "I've had my breakfast interrupted by a grizzly sow who wanted my oatmeal, and I've had to patch my own boots with duct tape and pine pitch. The wilderness isn't an office to me, Marcus. It's just home. It's got different rules, but they're consistent. If you respect them, you stay alive. And if you don't, the forest has a very efficient way of sorting out the people who think they're in charge," she said simply. We sat in the quiet for a long time, listening to the wind rise in the high branches of the cedar. It was a deep, rushing sound, like a distant river. Every now and then, a heavy clump of wet snow or frozen condensation would slide off a high limb and hit our roof with a soft, heavy thud. The lean-to didn't flinch. The thick pine poles and cedar boughs absorbed the impact without a sound. By 8 o'clock, the temperature outside had dropped well below freezing. The air entering the small gap in our shelter was sharp and dry now, the fog freezing into tiny crystals that hung in the air. "We need to share the blanket," Elena said. Her voice was practical, but there was a subtle shift in the air of the shelter. The easy space between us suddenly felt smaller. "I have my emergency bivvy," I offered, though I knew the thin foil sack would do little against the creeping chill of a freezing night. "Don't be stupid, Marcus," she said, her tone businesslike but not unkind. "A bivvy sack is a body bag that keeps you slightly warmer. If we combine our gear, we have my heavy tarp, your wool liner, and the space blanket. We lay the wool down, use the space blanket to reflect our heat, and put the tarp over the top to keep the drafts out. It's simple thermodynamics." "Thermodynamics," I repeated, a small smile on my face. "Right. Exactly. Now stop being polite and help me arrange the layers." We worked together in the cramped darkness, our bodies pressing against each other. As we shifted and tucked the blankets, it was a coordinated dance of limbs and fabric. When we were finished, we had created a tight insulated cocoon. I lay down on my side, my back against the rough, dried trunk of the cedar tree. Elena lay down beside me, her back against my chest, her head resting on her arm. The heat between us was immediate, a thick, heavy warmth that accumulated under the layers of wool and synthetic fabric. "You're like a furnace," she murmured, shifting slightly to tuck the wool blanket closer around her shoulders. "SAR training," I said, my chin resting near her hood. "We're taught to retain heat. It's a valuable skill." "It's an acceptable skill," she corrected, her voice soft. But don't get arrogant." I laughed softly, the sound muffled by the blankets. "Wouldn't dream of it." The night wore on in long, quiet intervals. I slept in short bursts, my ears trained to the sounds of the forest. In my line of work, you learn to sleep with one eye open. You listen for the snap of a branch that might mean a falling limb or the low rumble of a slide. But the forest tonight was quiet, locked in a deep, frozen sleep. Around midnight, I felt Elena stiffen. Her breathing, which had been slow and rhythmic, suddenly stopped. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I hear it," I whispered back. Outside, just beyond our shelter, there was a sound. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a falling branch. It was the slow, deliberate crunch of frozen needles under heavy weight. Crunch. It was close less than 10 feet away, right on the other side of our cedar bough wall. My hand instinctively went to my belt, finding the handle of my survival knife. It was a useless gesture against whatever was out there, but habit is a hard thing to break. "What is it?" I whispered near her ear. "It's not a bear," she breathed. "Too light. The stride is too short." The thought sent a cold streak down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. Cougars in the Cascades are usually ghost-like, avoiding humans with an almost supernatural diligence. But a cold, freezing night changes the math for predators. A small, warm shelter, smelling of human scent and dry cedar, might look like an interesting curiosity or a cornered meal. We lay perfectly still, our chests pressed together, our breathing shallow. The sound moved around the side of the tree. I could hear the faint, dry rustle of the cedar boughs as something brushed against our roof. Says, the structure creaked slightly under the gentle pressure. Elena didn't panic. She didn't squeeze against me or make a sound. Instead, she slowly reached down her hand, finding mine under the blanket. She squeezed my fingers, a steady, rhythmic pressure. 3 squeezes. Pause. 3 squeezes. It was a biological communication, a way to keep our heart rates down, to remind each other that we were still in control. The weight on the roof shifted. A small shower of dry needles drifted down through the cracks in our pine poles, landing softly on my cheek. I held my breath, my eyes wide in the pitch blackness of the shelter. Then there was a low huffing sound, a deep feline breath that smelled faintly of raw meat and cold forest air. It was right at the entrance of our shelter, where Elena's pack was blocking the wind. "Make yourself big," she whispered, her voice incredibly low but steady. "On 3, we yell. Not a scream, a shout, low and angry." "Got it," I whispered back. 1, 2. "Hey," we roared together, the sound booming inside the small enclosed space of our lean-to. The noise was deafening, amplified by the low ceiling and the hollow trunk of the cedar. Outside there was a sudden violent scramble of claws on bark. A heavy body hit the ground with a soft thud, followed by the rapid crashing sound of something large sprinting through the brush, snapping dead branches as it fled. We lay there for several minutes, the silence rushing back into the clearing like water. Our hearts were hammering against each other, a double-time rhythm under the heavy blankets. "Well," I said after a long moment, my voice slightly raspy, "that was effective. They're cowards." Elena said. Though her voice had a slight tremor in it now, she let out a long, shaky breath and turned around to face me in the darkness. "They don't like surprises. If you sound like a bigger predator, they'll almost always run. You sound like you've done that before." "Once," she admitted. "In the high country of the Wallawas, I had a young male follow me for 2 miles. I finally turned around, opened my arms with my rain jacket spread wide, and barked like a timber wolf. He nearly turned himself inside out trying to stop. I laughed, a quiet, genuine sound that felt good in the cold night. I would have paid money to see that." "It wasn't very dignified," she said. Her face was very close to mine now. In the faint ambient light that filtered through the cracks of our shelter, I could see the curve of her jaw, the dark shape of her eyes. The fear from the cougar had left a lingering charge in the air, a high-voltage warmth that made the small space feel even smaller. "Marcus," she said quietly. "Yeah? Your hand is still on your knife." I looked down, realizing my fingers were still white-knuckled around the hilt. I slowly let go, sliding my hand back under the wool blanket. "Occupational hazard," I said. "We're trained to be ready for anything." "You don't need the knife," she said softly. She reached out, her cool fingers finding my jaw, tracing the rough stubble along my cheekbone. Her touch was light, but there was a deliberate focus to it that made my breath catch in my throat. "I think we're safe now." "We are," I said. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she leaned forward, her forehead resting against mine. The heat between us was no longer just about survival. It had turned into something else, something quiet, intense, and completely natural. "You're a good partner, Marcus," she whispered. "I try to be useful," I replied. "You are," she said. And then she kissed me. It wasn't a desperate, dramatic kiss, but something warm, slow, and deeply grounded, matching the rhythm of the cold forest around us. Her lips were soft, tasting faintly of the single malt scotch and the dry, clean scent of the cedar needles. I reached up my hand, finding the back of her neck, my fingers tangling in the thick, damp silk of her hair. The wind continued to howl in the high branches of the Douglas firs, but inside our small, hand-built shelter, under the massive roots of the ancient cedar, the cold couldn't touch us. Paw. We held each other in the darkness, sharing our warmth, our breath, and a quiet, unspoken understanding that some of the best paths are the ones you get lost on. By 6 the next morning, the forest had begun to wake. The dark, heavy gray of the fog had thinned into a pale, translucent blue, and the first rays of winter sunlight were cutting through the high canopy, turning the frozen pine needles into sparkling fields of glass. I woke first, my body stiff but warm. Elena was still asleep, her head nestled in the crook of my shoulder, her breathing slow and even. I lay there for a few minutes, watching the light change, enjoying the quiet weight of her against me. "Elena," I whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. "The light's coming up." She stirred, letting out a soft, sleepy murmur before her eyes fluttered open. She looked at me, a small, sleepy smile appearing on her face. "Morning," she said, her voice husky. "The fog's gone," I said, pointing toward the small gap in our shelter. "We have clear blue sky." She sat up, stretching her arms above her head. Her joints popped in the cold air. "My back feels like it's been run over by a tractor," she complained, though there was no heat in her voice. "But I'm dry." "The shingling held," I said, crawling out of the shelter. The air outside was crisp and biting, freezing the moisture in my nose instantly, but the sun was bright, casting long, golden shadows across the snow-dusted forest floor. The clearing looked completely different than it had the night before, cleaner, wider, and less intimidating. I looked at the ground near our entrance. Sure enough, there were deep, rounded tracks in the light dusting of snow that had fallen after the fog froze. They were large, wider than my hand, with no claw marks visible. Elena crawled out after me, her boots crunching on the frozen needles. She knelt beside the tracks, tracing the outline of one with her finger. "4-year-old male," she said, her scientific focus returning instantly. He was curious, but he wasn't hunting. If he was hunting, the tracks would be narrower, deeper in the toes. "Good to know," I said. "I'll add that to my SARE report under miscellaneous wildlife interactions." "Make sure you spell my name right," she said, looking up at me with a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Dr. Elena Vance, with a V." "Oh, I'll write it in gold ink, doctor," I replied, We packed our gear quickly, our movements efficient and practiced. We didn't talk about what had happened during the night, but we didn't need to. The way we worked together had changed. There was an easy, familiar rhythm to our coordination now, a shared confidence that didn't require explanation. Before we left, I turned back to the lean-to. I pulled down the main structural poles, scattering the cedar boughs back across the clearing. In search and rescue, we teach leave no trace. You don't want a lost civilian finding an old shelter and thinking they can use it when it's already half-rotted. "Goodbye, tree," Elena said, patting the rough bark of the giant cedar. "It was a good host," I agreed, hoisting my pack onto my shoulders. "Now, let's go find our team. They're probably eating cold oatmeal and arguing about who gets to write the incident report." We navigated by the sun and the natural drainage of the slopes. Elena led the way, her knowledge of forest topography guiding us around the broken basalt ridges that had looked so terrifying in the dark. I followed close behind, keeping an eye on the trail and her steady, rhythmic pace. Within 2 hours, we heard the faint, high-pitched beep of a search dog's training collar. "Over here," I shouted, my voice carrying clearly through the crisp morning air. A few minutes later, 3 members of my SAR team broke through the brush. They were wearing their bright orange jackets, their faces red from the cold, looking exhausted and worried. "Marcus, Elena," our team leader Dave called out, rushing forward. "Where the hell have you guys been?" "We've had 2 teams on the ridge since sunrise. We got caught in the marine layer," I said, my voice steady and professional. "We lost radio contact when we dropped into the south draw. We made the call to bivouac under a cedar." Dave looked at us, his eyes scanning our gear. We were dirty. Our jackets smelled of cedar smoke and damp earth, but we were dry, alert, and standing on our own 2 feet. "You're not hypothermic?" Dave asked, incredulous. "The temperature on the ridge hit 18 degrees last night." "We had good gear," Elena said, stepping forward. Her voice was cool, her professional boundary firmly back in place. "And we used proper shelter geometry." "Marcus is an excellent assistant." "Assistant," I muttered under my breath, though I couldn't help but smile. "We're just glad you're safe," Dave said, letting out a long sigh of relief. The training director was about to call in the state patrol. "Let's get you back to the command tent. We've got hot coffee and some dry clothes." We walked back to the base camp in a loose group. As we approached the vehicles, Elena slowed her pace slightly, letting the other team members walk ahead. "So, Marcus," she said, her voice quiet. "Yeah? I have a seminar at the university on Tuesday," she said, looking straight ahead at the mountains. "But I'm usually free on Thursday evenings. If you're interested in analyzing more chemical compounds." I looked at her. Her face was calm, her cap pulled low, but there was a soft, steady warmth in her eyes that reminded me of the small fire we had shared in the dark. "I'd like that, Elena," I said. "No freeze-dried rations this time." "No," she said, her dry smile returning. "I know a place in town that has actual plates, and they don't serve scotch in metal cups." "That sounds like a very strict protocol," I said. "I respect protocols," she replied, matching my stride. "When they're practical." I reached out, my hand brushing against hers for a brief second as we walked toward the warm light of the command tent. The cold air of the mountains was still sharp around us, but for the first time in 9 years of search and rescue, the forest didn't feel like a wilderness I had to fight. It felt like a place where I had finally found my way home.